Thanks a bunch, Bill. Thank you. I'm supposed to have a clicker. I guess this is it. Okay, great. Thank you. And if you don't mind, I'm going to wander around because I get nervous energy when I talk in front of a group this big. It's really a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invitation to share some of our views on what's going on with the grid, what that means in terms of reliability and security risk, and what that means in terms of the outlook going forward. I'll talk a little bit about our summer assessment, which we released a couple weeks ago, and you've probably seen a fair amount of coverage on it in the popular press, which I think means we hit a nerve, which is good, because that's kind of what we wanted to do. We see a number of things going on with the grid and the environment that it operates in that causes us concern, and I hope becomes a real call to action to rethink a few of the things that are going on around the grid transformation. And then I'll come back and I'll talk at the end a little bit about what we call the 6 big questions that we think the industry ecosystem, by that I don't mean just NERC, but I mean the industry, policymakers, regulators, the NGOs that support the industry, really need to start to coalesce around in the coming years as we think about the grid that we're going to leave behind for our grandchildren. So if that's okay with you, that's what I plan to do, and I'll try to leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So let me talk first about what kind of how we think about the transitions going on in the grid, and we kind of think about it in 3 dimensions. And we call it a 3D transformation just for a gimmick. But it's clear to us that the grid is increasingly decarbonized, it's increasingly distributed, and it's increasingly digitized. Let me unpack that a little bit. Decarbonization. If you look at the majority of the resources being added to the grid, they're almost all wind and solar, with a handful of solar and battery hybrid systems. There's a very interesting chart floating around from Berkeley Labs that shows the aggregate interconnection queue across the United States, representing probably about 85% of the country. And what's interesting about it is the entire installed base of generation in the US is 1 terawatt. The interconnection queue is 1.5 terawatts. And it's all wind, solar, and battery assets with a small amount of natural gas in the middle of it. The size of the queue itself is staggering. But we all know that a queue is a queue, and most of that generation will never get built. But I think it goes to show the investor appetite for investing in clean energy projects, and and that's in response to a whole bunch of things. Somewhat in response to policy, but largely in response to what customers want and the economics of that generation. And it's great, right, from the standpoint of lowering the carbon footprint of the industry, but it comes at a cost, right? There's no free lunch in this industry, as you all know. And the issue with these variable resources is the variable production profile. You don't know that the wind's going to blow at any point in time. You don't know that the sun's going to shine at any point in time. And as utility executives, we all know that we have to worry more about the tails of the distribution of outcomes than the middle. And so that creates some real issues in terms of how we integrate those resources into the grid, particularly as they become a more and more substantial portion of the generation mix. Distributed generation. A lot of the generation that's coming online is coming online below the BPS level, or the BES level as we define it. A lot of it on the distribution system, and lots of it behind the meter. And again, there are benefits to that in terms of getting generation closer to load and giving customers a little bit more control over their resources. The problem is that system operators now don't see that generation as well as they do the stuff that's on the BES. And if you really want to be clear about it, we really don't know what load we're serving anymore in many places, because that load is masked by behind-the-meter generation. We only see the net amount. And that creates issues, particularly when solar starts to trip off for either a system disturbance or something like that. You both lose generation at one side of the equation, and you get a big surge in demand on the other. So it's an issue that the the operators have to learn to manage around. And then finally, digitization. We're seeing an extraordinary growth in industrial control systems on the grid, energy management systems within loads and so forth, the move to using power electronics to create reliability services out of things like solar PV. And again, there's a lot to be said for that because it brings a lot of efficiency, a lot of data, a lot of visibility across the grid. The issue is that every internet-connected device expands the attack surface for our cyber adversaries, who over the last 2 years have demonstrated that they're bad people, not dumb people. So we've got to be very, very mindful of the digitization challenges that are being brought along with the benefits of improved visibility. But anyway, we see these three trends as continuing. We don't see anything that's going to really stop them. They're largely driven by economics and customer preferences with supportive policy, but not really driven by policy so much. So let's go back and think about the last couple years. Other than the pandemic and everything we've learned about remote work and dealing with personal health and collective public health, we think that there's been some great clarity brought to some of the risks that we've been tracking through our Reliability Issues Steering Committee over the last several years. And we bucket those into a couple categories here. The first one is really the intersection of extreme weather with the grid transformation that I just talked about. And the second is supply chain and the cyber environment. Let's talk about extreme weather to start with. And the first thing we have to say about extreme weather is that extreme is extreme, not infrequent. We've seen I can't give you statistics on it because I don't think the statistics are well formed yet. But it sure feels like over the last several years, we've seen a very different kind of weather system that the industry has to be able to perform under than we've seen in the past. And the way we've characterized these weather systems is that they're broader, deeper, and longer. Broader in terms of the area of the country or the continent that gets impacted, which is a really big deal if that impacts your ability to rely on neighbors to transfer energy in and out of different control areas to balance loads. Deeper, meaning more extreme temperatures, either hotter in the summer or colder in the winter. And then longer duration events, which is a big deal if you're relying on an inventoried fuel or if you're relying on customer participation to get you through an energy emergency. And these are the characteristics we've seen play out in things like the August 2020 California load shed. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, it was like a Tuesday afternoon in August. It was a hot day. One of the characteristics of the California grid with the amount of solar that they have on it is that around 5, 6 o'clock in the afternoon, all the solar generation starts to drop off. At the same time, you're still building load because the peak doesn't really occur until about 8 o'clock at night in the summer. And the Cal ISO on that day wasn't able to import the power they needed to fill the gap between the solar dropping off and the load continuing to build. And why was that? It was because it was hot in Vancouver, it was hot in Seattle, it was hot in Portland, it was hot in Salt Lake City, it was hot in Denver, it was hot in Phoenix, it was hot in Tucson, it was hot everywhere. So it's in one of these wide area heat domes, and there just wasn't any juice to import. So they shed load to about 800,000 customers on that day. Winter Storm Uri last year in Texas is another great example of a weather system that was much colder than typically you would plan for in that part of the country. But more importantly, it impacted about two-thirds of the country. We did some math looking at our situation awareness data, and ERCOT was short, I think, 20 gigawatts of generation. And we looked around the country on that day to find out whether there was 20 gigawatts of generation available anywhere. And it turns out that there was, but you would have been able to wheel it from Texas from peninsular Florida, from the upper Midwest, from the Pacific Northwest, and so forth. So the whole area in that part of the country was completely congested with the responding to that storm. And then over the last several years, we've all developed a lexicon of weather terms that most of us, at least I had never heard of, prior to maybe 10 years ago. But we talk about polar vortices, derehos, bomb cyclones, heat domes are now part of the common lexicon that we talk about, and I think that in of itself is reflective of a changing environment. Let me switch and talk about supply chain. Starting with the SolarWinds compromise that was uncovered in December of 2020. It was just a steady drumbeat of vulnerabilities that were uncovered in very commonly used programs. I've listed a few of them here: Microsoft Exchange, Pulse Connect Secure, which is a remote connection platform, very critical for use in a period with a lot of remote work. The Kaseya, Log4j, VMware, etc. And this is pretty extraordinary on a couple dimensions. One is, one of the things that we always thought about as we looked at the cyber protections on the grid is we always thought that the prospect of a coordinated attack against the infrastructure was very unlikely, because it would require you to pick off a bunch of individual assets, any one of which is fairly difficult to compromise. And the notion of someone being able to compromise a bunch of them to do something nefarious with seemed like a very long putt. So we don't have very strong protections across some part of the grid. So what these supply chain vulnerabilities and compromises have changed that calculus, because now you don't have to pick off each individual asset. An adversary only has to corrupt a commonly used program, and then it can, in the way the SolarWinds compromise worked, infect systems of that company's customers, win administrative rights, traverse networks, cover their tracks, and it's very, very difficult to defend against. So they've solved a one-on-one problem with a one-to-many solution. And that's very troubling as we think about the risks to the electric grid. We've been fortunate, largely due to the protections that the SIP standards provide, that we haven't seen any activation of any malware within the bulk electric system, but it remains an extraordinary risk to the grid, and one that we're thinking very hard about what needs to be put in place to protect against those. And the pace of these vulnerabilities is picking up at an extraordinary rate. I think last year the National Institute of Standards identified 22,000 software vulnerabilities, which was over 60 a day. And for the first half of this year, we're on a pace to exceed that. And the issue with these vulnerabilities is that once they're uncovered, it becomes a foot race between the good guys trying to get the patches developed and patches out onto their systems, and the adversaries who now know that there's a vulnerability and they're going to go start looking for ways to exploit it. So this treadmill that we've been on, and I'm sure many of your staffs have been on, at trying to keep your systems patched and up to date, no sign that that's going to go away anytime soon. And it's really critical that we can devote the resources we need to provide those necessary protections. I want to talk a little bit about Colonial Pipeline, because I think it's a very sobering example of one of the risks we run in the electric grid. So Colonial Pipeline, ransomware event was 2 summers ago, and ended up having to shut down the pipeline, which is with a major petroleum product pipeline for the Eastern Seaboard. And what was interesting is, sitting in Atlanta, within 2 or 3 hours of them shutting down the pipeline, an immediate price response at the gas stations. Within 2 days, we were rationing gas. Many places were shut down because they didn't have any. And this is a system that has a tremendous amount of inventory in and around the market areas. If that had been a natural gas pipeline, we would have been in a world of hurt. Both the gas LDCs would have been shorted almost immediately, and the power generation on the Eastern Seaboard that relies on natural gas would have been shut in as well. So it goes to show, one, the magnitude of the cross-sector vulnerabilities that we have with the natural gas business, but I think also raises a whole bunch of concerns over the cyber protections that are in place in the pipeline sector. And I don't have great visibility into those. I know TSA has been working on strengthening those with the pipelines, but it's an area of great concern to us that the fuel meaning natural gas, which is increasingly the fuel that keeps the lights on around the country, could be so vulnerable to a cyber event on either their operating systems or, in this case, an enterprise system. So that's kind of how we think about the world. Real concerns around the interaction of climate and the reforming grid, and then secondly, the cyber environment that we're in, and particularly the supply chain issues. So let me turn to everybody's favorite chart, or what's become everybody's favorite chart. This is a summary of our summer 2022 reliability outlook, and it's gotten a tremendous amount, as I said, a tremendous amount of attention, including me getting summoned to brief the Secretary of Energy tomorrow on it. But it's interesting. We started in 2018, we do a long-term assessment of reliability, looking out 10 years. And that was the first time that we saw that it was likely that there would be unserved energy in California due to the resource transition and the weather conditions that they were likely to see. And every year since then, we've seen something that we used to be confined to California and Texas. We've always had concern around Texas and the very tight reserve margins in the Texas market. But every year we've done these, the area has grown. First it was just the Southern California and Texas, and then it was the broader Western interconnection. And this year you can see almost 2/3 of the country, pretty much everything east of the Mississippi River, we have characterized as elevated risk for energy shortfalls. And then here in our backyard here in Indiana, a fairly high risk in the MISO area, particularly MISO North. And I'm sure John Barrow will be talking about that in his talk later this afternoon. But what's driving this? It's a couple things. One, NOAA's forecast for weather this summer is for most of the country to have hotter than normal weather conditions, particularly in the West. Continued drought in the West. So I think I've read this as the 22nd straight year of technically determined drought conditions. You've all seen pictures of the Colorado River and Lake Mead and so forth. Places tremendous stress on the entire system in the West. And it's not just the hydro generation in the West, which we clearly can't count on for as much capacity as we normally would. But it also affects your ability to run thermal plants. That's one of the issues in the SPP part of the region. It relies on the Missouri River, that river basin for cooling for thermal plants, and that could be placed at risk given the drought conditions that we have. Drought also promotes wildfires. And the wildfire season started very early this year. And in fact, in California now, they don't even think of it as a wildfire season anymore because it seems to be a year-round phenomenon. But with wildfires, you have the risk of transmission lines being taken out of service, either as a result of the wildfire or to prevent a wildfire now. And that, again, can limit your ability to move power around the grid to where it needs to be. So we've got issues in the West around demand, supply with the drought conditions, and then the wildfire risk impacting transfers. I talked about SPP and the issue with once-through cooling. That could become an issue for them during a period of high demand. And then in the MISO area, this is kind of a 20th century problem. Just too many generators have retired relative to the demand outlook. And that's really put a real squeeze on reserve margins, particularly in MISO North. You all probably saw the results of the capacity auction a few weeks ago, where I think capacity cleared in MISO South at like $3 a megawatt day, and it was closer to 300 megawatt day in the North. And that's just reflecting the supply-demand balance there. What's going on in the background of all this is a little bit of economic rebound coming out of the pandemic as well, and some population migration, particularly into Texas. So it's a pretty sobering outlook for this summer, for sure. So how do we prevent this going forward? Well, we've looked at this, and we've kind of boiled down our thinking into 6 questions that we think the utility, electricity, energy ecosystem needs to kind of coalesce around as we move forward. And these aren't questions for NERC, these are questions for all of us to work our way through, and there's no simple answer to them. The first one is going to be, where do we get the reliable balancing resources that are going to allow us to integrate extraordinarily large amounts of variable generation? Over the long term, those could be batteries, but it's a lot of batteries. Certainly much more than what we're deploying at the pace we're deploying today. It'll be interesting to hear Jim Robo's take on batteries at his talk in a little bit. It could, over the long term, could be hydrogen, but we're a long, long way from building a hydrogen capability at the scale we would need to have. Could be small nuclear reactors if they can load follow very flexibly, but again, those are a long way off being deployed at the kind of scale that we're talking about. In the interim, we have natural gas, and that's really, as I said, the fuel that keeps the lights on and the fuel that allows us to integrate all the renewables, because gas plants can be built so responsibly. So we have to be really, really thoughtful about how we reinforce the natural gas business until we get some alternatives in place that can be deployed at the scale that they need to be deployed at. So gas is a really big issue for us during this transition. The second $1 million question is, how the hell are we going to get infrastructure built in this country? And I know we have a conversation coming up later today on transmission siting and planning, but I've been party to and observed so many right-minded transmission projects not be able to get through the local siting process and therefore being stymied. And I know we have this joint task force between FERC and NERC trying to sort through ways that we might break the siting challenges associated with energy infrastructure, but that's a big one, because there's not a future I can envision where we're going to hit anywhere near the renewable development, carbon abatement strategies and goals the country has set for itself without a tremendous amount of transmission, both to unlock renewables in places like the Midwest and the desert Southwest, get them to load centers, as well as to build the resiliency network that we're going to need to do all that reliably. Third is we need to kind of think differently about resilience and the kinds of tools that we're going to need to have in our toolkit to maintain a resilient electric system in the wake of a grid that's going to be increasingly impacted by extreme weather. And again, extreme is extreme, not infrequent, with a sector that's going to be impacted in different ways by weather. We've always worried about weather systems knocking out distribution infrastructure so we couldn't deliver power. We always worried about what it would mean in terms of load on extremely hot or extremely cold days. But now it also affects our ability to generate, given that so much of the generation fleet is tied to weather conditions as well. The fourth one is looking at the reconfiguration of the grid that's happening before our eyes. I like to say that we inherited our grandfather's grid and we're building the grid we leave our grandchildren. We're rebuilding it in front of our eyes, and we have an opportunity now to build security protections into the grid as opposed to bolt them on afterwards, which is basically what we've done to date. And so we know that we're going to have pressure to put more interconnected devices on the grid, that there's going to be more artificial intelligence and technology advancements we can make in terms of grid operations. But we need to be very, very thoughtful about how we secure those devices onto the grid and not let the attack surface just grow unabated. And then secondarily, we really need to have the confidence that the fuel supply is protected as well. The fifth one has to do with physical attack, and I'm not talking here just about what we call our SIP 14 critical assets that need to comply with the SIP physical security standard. But given the rise in domestic terrorism, new technologies such as drones that are ubiquitously available and all tied to the Chinese government in some way, shape, or form, we really kind of have to ask ourselves, are we doing enough to physically protect the system? And are there other things that we need to be doing, again, beyond the SIP 14 critical assets, just to protect the infrastructure that we have in place from domestic attack? And then finally, I have this feeling, and talking with my colleagues that understand some of this stuff better than I do, we've taken models and we use rules of thumb that were all basically built in the 50s, when we had a metal bending economy and a resource base which was primarily coal, oil, and nuclear. And that's not the economy we have anymore, and that's not the resource base we have anymore. So we really need to think about whether or not we've tortured all of those models and rules of thumb and things that we carry in our head as far as we can. And we really need a new platform for thinking about how this grid that we're developing is going to work. And that's going to cause us to ask questions about, do we have the right people? Do we have the right tools? Do we know how to model these systems, against the kinds of scenarios that we have? Do we even really know what scenarios we should be planning for anymore? Because, looking backwards over the last 100 years to determine, the most likely weather scenarios doesn't feel very smart, if the climate is changing as rapidly as it feels like it is around us. So I think there are a whole bunch of issues around people, process, and tools that we need to be asking ourselves, because we know that the tails are going to become increasingly important, the tails of the distribution going forward. And we know we're going to have much poorer visibility into loads, and we're going to have much poorer visibility into resource availability. So there's going to be some revolution in mindset and thinking around how the grid gets planned and operated that I think needs to come into place. And so let me wrap up and talk a little bit about what we're doing. So we've had a lengthy conversation with our board over the last 9-10 months around the risk environment that we see, the issues that it raises for grid performance. And we really have kind of landed on 4 main themes that we're going to focus on at NERC. And really there's a fifth, because there's the implicit, and we're going to do everything else that we need to do day in and day out. But in terms of kind of special emphasis over the course of the next 2 to 3 years. The first one, we talk about the energy challenge. And this kind of, again, results from the grid transformation and the climate change issues that we're seeing. And the recognition is that we have always focused our attention on capacity on peak plus a reserve margin. And the implicit assumption was if we had enough generation on peak that could serve the peak hour as we expected it to be, and enough of a margin around that to allow us to cover all the random plants tripping and outages that we would see on the system, that we'd be able to serve the peak hour reliably and every other hour of the year. Well, in the new electricity system, that math doesn't work, because your ability to serve on peak doesn't really say anything about your ability to serve any other hour of the year anymore, because we don't know if fuel's going to be there, given the reliance on wind, solar, and natural gas. So we really need to kind of transform our thinking from the capacity, and capacity is the key driver of reliability, to really thinking about how are we going to supply energy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. We've got some good work that's been done on this in places like ISO New England, where they've had to manage energy with a very, very tight fuel supply situation over the last 10 years or so. They've developed some tools and techniques that are very valuable. But we're seeing this across all the ISO areas, where they're really starting to see the impact of renewable development, variability of supply, and there's a consensus building that we really need to kind of rethink the way we do planning, to focus more on energy than on capacity. Capacity remains important, but it gives false comfort, because we really need to tear apart the energy side of the equation as well. The second is security, and we're going to put a particular focus on supply chain. supply chain vulnerabilities, making sure that we've got the right relationships with the Department of Energy, Homeland Security, FBI, and CIA, such that when a vulnerability is discovered or a threat is discovered to the grid, we can rapidly get that communicated out to the industry with appropriate mitigating steps in place. We do that through the EISAC. We're also very, very impressed with the insights that we're able to develop across a couple monitoring programs that we run on behalf of the industry. We've had for a long time a program called CRISP, which is a IT enterprise system monitoring capability that we do execute in conjunction with Department of Energy. I don't know I know there are a few G&Ts that have signed up to be part of CRISP. I don't know if any co-ops directly have, but it allows us to monitor system traffic and find anomalies. When we have a vulnerability, we can put the indicators of compromise into CRISP and start scanning utility systems to see if they're showing any of those. And it's a great tool, and it's really not that expensive in the grand scheme of things. And the second is last year we started a program to take all of our CRISP participants through a pilot where we've added in operating technology monitoring capability through a product that Dragos offers called Neighborhood Keeper, and through an NERC product called Essence. And we're starting to see some interesting insights as we can kind of cross-rough what we're seeing in the OT environments with the IT environments. And then last year, when the National Security Council and then DOE picked up the mantle on these 100-day sprints to put OT monitoring capabilities in place across the industry, we've been in the middle of that with the ISAC in terms of both helping to get the sensors deployed and doing the threat hunts and the analytics on the findings. We think there's lots of potential here, and it's really probably a capability that the majority of the industry ought to have in place given the threat environment that we have. Cyber design, our technical committee. We call it the Reliability and Security Technical Committee, the big stakeholder committee that supports us with all the industry SMEs and so forth, has put in place a working group called CITES. I can't for the life of me remember what the acronym stands for, so there's your acronym challenge for the day, Bill. But it's basically looking at, in the near, medium, and long term, how we should think about cyber engineering relative to the grid. And very high potential here, we think, to really kind of understand what we're seeing through the ISAC, what we're seeing through all of our industry outreach and the SME community we can bring together to really start thinking about how we start engineering out some of these vulnerabilities. And then finally, continuing to look at the structure of the SIP standards and making sure that they're relevant and contemporary for the threat environment that we're in. And I know the SIP standards aren't everyone's favorite topic, but they've really served us well over the last couple years with some clear examples of where the security perimeters that we require to put in place have really protected the operating systems of the industry. But we really need to rethink that in the context of supply chain vulnerabilities and this kind of new math around coordinated attack that I talked about earlier. And one of the things that I really want to see us do is to get our SIP standards, the cyber engineering effort, the outreach we can do to the industry through the 6 regional entities, and the ISAC, all kind of working in a way that we're really advancing the security posture of the industry collectively. So that's one of the goals we have in the security arena. The third one is a recognition that the pace of change in the industry right now is really pretty unprecedented. And we were formed originally when we were given statutory authority in 2005. At that point we were really worried about utilities trimming trees appropriately and regularly. We were worried about facility ratings, kind of all that kind of good spinach, bread and butter stuff that's still, by the way, very, very important to make sure is getting done correctly. But we really weren't set up to do and address all of the things that are happening to the industry right now. And one of the things that we've come to realize is that our processes, were designed, and very, very appropriately, to be reflective, deliberative, consultative, and they're very time-consuming. So one of the things that we want to take a look at is looking at ways we can keep all the good stuff about the way we do our work, particularly our work with stakeholders, but find ways to do it more efficiently and in a more timely way. And a lot of this comes to root in our standards process, which is an extraordinarily effective process on so many different dimensions except timeliness. And if we can keep all the good stuff and speed that up, I think we'll all feel very, very good about where we are. Absent that, we need to find other ways to drive action before we can get a standard in place, because it's always going to take a while to get a standard in place. And I don't think we should be chasing every issue with a standard. I want to be clear about that. But for example, we've starting in 2017, we started doing a lot of tremendously good work on inverters and the way inverters behave with system disturbances and so forth. Published reliability guidelines. We worked with IEEE to get it embedded in one of their standards. We've got NERC to endorse and embrace the requirements in it. We still see that the vast majority of the inverter-based resources on the system don't conform to the guideline. So there's something here that we're missing collectively, that there are some really simple things that PV assets can do that will make them contribute to reliability as opposed to detract from it. And we're struggling to figure out how to drive that action. So it's one of the things we're going to take up with a stakeholder task force this summer, is really thinking about what are the tools we should be using to drive and motivate action before we have a standard in place. Because we know the standards motivate action, but there should be other ways we can get smart stuff done. And then the last thing is what we call here sustainability. And I don't mean sustainability here in the environmental sense, but we were, in many ways as a company, we were born in 2005, even though we've been around for 50 years, right? But we went through an extraordinary transformation when we were given statutory authority by Congress. And as you look around NERC, we have a lot of things that are held together by chicken wire and chewing gum. And it's been good from a cost effectiveness perspective, but I think we're really getting a handle around the risk associated with some of those activities. And one of the most important ones is cyber. It's become very clear to me since I took this job 4 years ago that the data we steward on behalf of the industry needs to be protected as well as the best of the industry protect their data. So we've initiated a number of projects to make sure that compliance data that we collect is highly secured in terms of and temporally secured, so that we get rid of it when we don't need it anymore. But we need to make sure that we have the same cyber protections we have in place that we would expect the best of industry to have. So there's a fair amount of investment in our systems, eliminating single points of failure across the company, and really kind of investing in our own infrastructure, because that lowers our risk and by extension lowers risk for the entire industry. So those are our 4 priorities: energy security, agility, and sustainability, as we kind of respond to the changing environment that we're operating in. And then, as I said, there's a 5th area underneath, which is to do everything else excellently, because there's an awful lot of other stuff that is in our mandate. So with that, you're probably tired of hearing me babble on, but I'd be happy to try to take a few questions before we go to break, if I hit any nerves with anybody. Okay. Yeah, Mike.
I'll just move to one.
And I'm sorry, I can't see really, really well, so if there's anybody else, just yell out.
Okay. I was going to wind up yelling, so I figured I'd move over here. Obviously, the chart you showed that you're going to discuss with Secretary Granholm caught everyone's attention here. You talked about the PRA at MISO, the auction, and we're going to talk to John Baer about that. I think what a lot of people are curious about in the audience, if we stopped coal retirements today and shutting nuclear plants down, is that enough to help, or are we past that point? And I think Most of us assume we're not. It's like, hey, if we can slow down the coal retirements, we can slow down the nuclear retirements, do this more thoughtfully, we can be successful. Your map kind of shows otherwise, like are we past the point of no return?
It's a good and it's an interesting question. And first of all, we try to stay as fuel agnostic as we can. Not agnostic, we believe in fuel. I guess we're fuel ambivalent. It would be the right terminology. But I had this discussion with Chairman Glick last week, and what we really need to be able to do is to be able to define the services that we need that will, support the rest of the system, if you will. And there's in my mind there needs to be some sort of, I use insurance capacity in the market, or some sort of, in case of emergency, break glass, right? That we could get some capacity that we know we could rely on up and running very, very quickly. Now, whether that's retaining coal plants or retaining nuclear plants, they can probably play that role. But gas plants can play that role as well. And I think one of the things that is frustrating to us, but I think also maybe pushes us where we want to be, is I don't like the sound bites that are coming out of our summer assessment that's saying we're adding renewables too quickly or we're doing this too quickly, because it all needs to be done in the context of everything else going on. Now, at the pace that we're adding renewables to the system, I do believe we need more flexibility in the system. And that probably means more natural gas generation, because gas can ramp up and down a lot faster than a nuclear plant or a coal plant could. But I think the essence of your question is one I would agree with, which is our issue isn't the pace at which we're adding renewables, it's the pace at which the other stuff is dropping out. And in 2018, we did an assessment on this, and we kind of came back and said, look, there's no reason why the clean energy vision that we have for the country can't be made a reality, right? With enough time, engineering, talent, and money, we can make anything work. But we can't get there too quickly. And that's been our call for managing the pace of the transition. And it has to do with resource addition, the kinds of resources coming on the grid, the resources that are being retired, and the recognition that, retiring 1,000 megawatts of coal isn't going to be replaced by 1,000 megawatts of solar. We all know that, right? And that's the complicating factor in here. And it also depends on where we are in terms of battery development and deployment. Again, we're nowhere near the amount of batteries we would need on the grid to have a fully renewable grid, but could we get there? Possibly. Will we get there with lithium ion? I tend to doubt it, but I'm not a battery scientist. So, some thoughts. And not a crisp answer, I'm sorry. Yeah.
If I could just follow up on Mike's question, I mean, to me, not only do we have that issue of are we past that point or not, we have what EPA is trying to do, which is about 12 new regulations in the next 12 months. ELG, CCR, PM, cross-state air pollution rule, regional haze, et cetera, et cetera. So if you didn't think we were past the point, how do we make sure we don't pass the point because of what EPA is trying to do so quickly to that existing fleet? And just curious if you all have had discussions with them or your thoughts on what they're trying to do in that full context of making sure we don't shut down the fleet too quick. Thank you.
Yeah, we have some conversation with EPA, but we're not number one on their list of concerns when they reach out on this. And this has been one of our pleas, to Congress, whenever I get the stump to stand on, is to make sure that as we put any policies in place that impact the generation fleet of the country, that we keep reliability having a seat at the table. And we really understand the implications of that. Again, I don't have any authority over what the EPA does and doesn't do, but I am asking for a seat, right, and for the voice to be heard. I think back to the question that Mike asked. The other thing I would say though is that It's pretty simple to say that this clean energy transition is being driven by government edict and government policy, but I don't really think that's the case. I think it's being driven by economics and being driven by what customers are saying they want. Particularly the large industrials, right, who are trying to create a green image for their products. And I think policy is largely accommodating, and in some cases undoubtedly supporting that. And the utilities are supporting it too. I mean, you saw probably saw the Wall Street Journal article with EEI's assessment of CapEx over the next 2 years. I think in 21 and 22, the investor-owned utilities are going to invest something like $280 billion. To kind of integrate clean infrastructure or clean technologies into their systems. I mean, that's extraordinary. That's like $60 billion a year of new revenue requirements, if I do the math right. The generation queue, I think, shows where the new additions are going to come from. So I don't think this is a genie that's going to go back into the bottle very easily. So I think we better be working, and part of my message to the secretary on tomorrow is going to be, we really got to be working on how we're going to create the rest of the system around these renewable resources, because they're here to stay, and I think that trend's going to continue. Yeah.
Virtual attendee? Sorry, I'm not this tall. There we go. On the first bullet of your presentation, where are we on the development of artificial inertia to substitute for the loss of thermal generation?
Could you read that again, please?
On the first bullet from your presentation, where are we on the development of artificial inertia to substitute for the loss of thermal generation?
Artificial inertia? Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay. So that's a good question. I've had this before, right? We can create a tremendous amount of what we call essential reliability services through power electronics. Inverters, they can provide frequency response. They can provide, as I understand it, they can provide VARs and voltage support. They certainly can be programmed to ride through system disturbances better than they do right now. Whether that's fully interchangeable with large spinning mass-driven inertia, I can't say. But I do know that they can be positive contributors in that area. I just don't think we know what a system that's preponderantly with those services being provided through power electronics, what they do. So it's kind of a non-answer, and I apologize for that. But there's hope. Anything else? Again, I can't see hands, so is there one? There's somebody's pointing over here. Is there a question over here?
Over here. Oh. You mentioned that the NERC was looking to retool its standard development to be more agile. When I think about standard development, I think about collaboration between all the stakeholders that are involved in a given standard. And I was wondering how you envision that working with the industry partners who are going to be involved in that.
So it's a great question, and I've come to learn that whenever I say retool the standards process, stakeholders here, we're kicking you out, which isn't true. And in fact, the power of our standards process is that industry's got a seat at the table. I mean, industry actually writes the standards and votes and approves on them. And while that process is time-consuming, what emerges at the end is largely agreed to, right? So it doesn't then go into the courts and all the litigation that you have around environmental rules and the like. So from an end-to-end perspective, our ability to recognize an issue and then have a mandatory enforceable standard in place is not that bad. Compared to other agencies, which isn't to say that it can't be made faster. And the things that we're looking at are things such as, one, we may spend a year and a half, fine-tuning the language in a standards authorization request. And the standards authorization request really only gets you to the point where you assign a team of SMEs, subject matter experts, to go start working on the standard. And so it seems to us that we could shorten that period of time, get the people who really know what they're talking about assigned to a team to start working on it, and getting a drafting team assigned much quicker. Now that probably means the drafting team process might take a little bit longer, but I think we would eliminate a lot of front-end churning that's really not particularly valuable relative to actually working through how you would create a series of requirements. That's one. Second is the way the ANSI process works is that we end up having to create written responses to every comment that we receive in response to a ballot posting, and there's really no reason why every comment needs to be responded to, right? If we could kind of group them into themes or something like that. I want to make sure that everybody feels like they're heard and understands that we're taking the feedback and that the drafting team is incorporating that in their thinking. But again, that's a very, very cumbersome process to do that. And the third one is once a standard passes a ballot, we have to wait 30 days and do another ballot on it. It's kind of like one of those, are you really sure you meant to vote that way? Type processes. And again, don't see a whole lot of value in that. So we looked at that and said, look, we could probably take maybe 4 to 6 months out of the standards development process just by eliminating some of these process steps that don't really seem to move the ball forward very much. That's the staff's thinking, but we've just commissioned a team that's driven by the stakeholders with our support and a couple of our board members involved to kind of really rethink how could we take some of the inefficiency out of the process, keep all the good stuff, and get something that we could get something done 60% faster than we do today. That's the thinking that we have in place. We believe that there's an answer to that. We believe that it's an answer that will not diminish industry's role or ownership over the standards at all, but just make things move along a little bit more quickly. So that's what we have in mind. Anything else? Yeah.
Building on Mike's question from earlier, but thinking about what do you see the role for NERC to play in resource adequacy? Nationally, the states have held that it's their responsibility for resource adequacy, and that seems to be a bit antiquated in a world that's very much interconnected, and we're all relying on everyone sharing on the grid in large part outside of Texas to be able to support one another. And as we see more and more retirements, the states aren't stepping in to stop those retirements and ensure resources are built timely to be able to replace them. What role do you see NERC playing in being able to address that, or at least raise this? Your summer assessment's drawing attention to it, but how do we further that effort?
No, it's a great question, and it's one that we talk about a lot. We're actually explicitly prohibited in the statute from being able to order anybody to build. That's pretty clear and unambiguous. So, short of a congressional action, which I don't really think is likely, I don't see us having a more formal role in resource adequacy than we do today. What we are trying to do, but we're not sitting on our hands. We have, when our summer assessments have become much more accessible. I mean, they used to be, 100-page engineering documents, and we've now got them boiled down to some simple visuals that you can tell a story around. And we've also marshaled the regional entities to really create state outreach programs to provide education to policymakers, whether they're regulators, state energy offices, or in some cases legislative committees that might be thinking about energy policy changes within the states, to be able to inform those. We take great pride in not lobbying for outcomes. We're not a lobbying organization. We don't try to carry anybody's water. It's our independence is what gives us some power in this conversation. But to really lay out the considerations that the policymakers need to be thinking about and understanding the consequences of different choices that they could make. We do a lot of bully pulpit stuff like this. We've also developed a pretty regular rhythm with NERC with their electricity committee. We meet with them twice a year around these assessments and have gotten a fairly productive and friendly dialogue with them. I mean, they see the same set of issues, but from their perch, right? And we all recognize that, you know, there may be a bright line between federal regulation and state regulation, but in reality, it's blurry in terms of how things actually work, and we need to work together on it. So I think there's reason for hope on that. But you know, short of doing assessments like this that really start to lay out the consequences of choices, our powers are fairly limited. I will say that our long-term assessment is a better one than these seasonal assessments, because the problem with the seasonal assessment is that by the time you've written it, the die is largely cast. Now, there are a few things this summer that we need to think about in terms of, you know, there's a tariff being contemplated by the Commerce Department on solar panels from certain countries that could retard the amount of solar that's plans to come online this summer that we're counting on. There's supply chain issues that maybe somebody could help, you know, deconstipate somewhere along the way. But, you know, the die is largely cast by the time you get to May and you're talking about the next 3 months. But when you start looking at the 10-year out forecast, you can start to see a lot more tangible actions that states and the industry and policymakers could be taking to kind of change the outcome. Have I worn you out? I think I've worn them out. Oh, no, one more. Okay.
Jim, I knew you were going to kick off this conference well, so thank you. I mean, what a great presentation. I'm going to give you my interpretation of what I think I heard you say and let you speak to something that I think was subtle. One is, you know, all of us are looking at what do we do with resources in the future. And what I heard you say is there's a lot of things to think about. Good luck. But the piece that I thought was subtle was it's information that's going to make a difference towards reliability. In your ability to pass information on to the system operator, be that the co-ops themselves or the people that operate system, the balancing authority, otherwise, is going to be very valuable. Is that a fair assumption of something you were getting to? Is that information of what's going on behind the meter or close to the meter is going to be very valuable in the future?
I think that's absolutely the right interpretation. I think, you know, I've come to develop a much better appreciation of the value of situation awareness over the last couple years, and not just within the electric system. And we have issues within the electric system. I mean, the visibility that the operators are going to have into what's going on in the distribution system, those information flows need to improve, and I think they will with some of the you know, smart devices that we're putting on the grid, the control systems, but also the cross-sector visibility. You know, the headline in the Winter Storm Uri event, other than the fact that it was really cold in Texas for 4 or 5 days, was the extraordinary lack of coordination between the electric and the gas system. You know, both in terms of how the systems were structured, as well as the real-time, you know, exchange of information, which we kind of take for granted in the electric system, right? Because we're very interdependent with each other. The gas system hasn't grown up that way, and the lack of visibility that the electric system had to what was going on in the gas system and vice versa. I mean, that was the headline there, and that's one of the key issues that needs to be straightened out as well. And I'll take a little bit of umbrage. I really didn't mean to say, here are your choices, good luck, although it may come across that way. I think the real call to action here is, you know, people want to get rid of coal. I get it. They want to get rid of gas. I get it. But you can't do it too quickly. It's kind of, there's some paraphrasing of the Einstein quote that, you know, things should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. You know, we should move as fast as we can, but no faster. And the thing that's going to gate our ability to really reduce our dependence on fossil fuels isn't the amount of renewables we can put on the system, because we can invest in renewables all day long. The real issue is getting the supporting technologies in place, whether it's batteries, hydrogen, SMRs, And I just really think, there's no press here, so I can say this boldly, right? We got to get off the dime on that, right? You know, if we're really, really serious about this, we should triple the amount of money that we're putting into battery research. Because I don't think lithium-ion batteries are going to be the technology we're going to want to use. I think we'll look back on lithium-ion batteries in 10 years and look at them the same way we look at nickel-cadmium batteries today. Right, there'll be some technology breakthrough, but someone's got to spend the money to figure that out. I mean, in the meantime, I think putting lithium batteries on the system is very good. They do lots of great things for the grid in terms of slowing ramp rates, managing frequency response and the like. But for the grid that people talk about, we're going to need, you know, gigawatts of storage all over the place, not megawatts. And that's just a very different equation that we really need to kind of push on. I think the role of nuclear is going to emerge as a really important topic. And you know, these small modular reactors seem to me like they have a lot of potential. I'm not a nuclear engineer, by the way. They seem to me they have an awful lot of appeal to them. But you know, again, it may be 10 years before we have the first pilot project up and running. So the other stuff's not happening fast enough, in my mind. Yes, sir.
On-site fuel storage. As we're switching from coal and nuclear to natural gas, what's your concern with having the lack of on-site fuel storage?
It's a big concern. And one of the things that's beautiful about the natural gas system is, you know, they will tell you, and I got no reason to believe that they're wrong, that they've never missed a firm delivery, except under some sort of a force majeure situation. And I think one of the issues we have is that many generators aren't incented or have a financial model that allows them to enter into firm contract delivery. So that's an issue that needs to get resolved. The other issue is that in the context of gas shortages, for whatever set of reasons, production shortages or weather or what have you, typically the power plants are the lowest priority for delivery. You know, first will be the LDCs. And for good reason on that. Like, nobody wants to shut off an LDC and then have to go deal with kind of restarting it when supply returns. But I think power plants and the generation fleet needs to be much higher in the priority queue for gas delivery. Most of our thinking around natural gas is rooted in 1980s thinking. Right, when gas was kind of a hobby fuel for the electric industry, it was, you know, it was an economic choice for displacing oil. But now that it's become kind of the critical fuel for keeping the lights on, our policies need to recognize that, and I don't think they have yet. I'm not seeing. Okay, Mike, I got one more, and I think I'm over time, so this is on you.
So you touched on SMRs, and you know, when we look at the generation of commissioners at the NRC that retired probably in the last 10 to 15 years, they were the people behind the program and behind nuclear construction. And we've moved to a generation where it's don't build it kind of NRC mentality. Do you see that changing again? With the cost of the large plants like Vogtle and what we've seen of late, we know that that's a financial challenge for people. But with SMRs, what's going on in China with new technology, we're clearly behind on nuclear technology as a country. Do you see that? Is that just a time issue, or? I mean, from what I can see now, the NRC is not supportive of nuclear construction. You know, how do we overcome that?
Yeah, that's a little bit above my pay grade. I honestly I don't know the answer to that, but what I have been told, and this is kind of what I have been told. So this is, you know, secondhand, not primary NERC analysis I'm citing, but I've been told that the small reactors can perform very, very acceptably. I won't talk about safety, performance, and environmental impact. That's different. But in terms of their ability to perform reliably, to be able to load follow and do the kinds of things that the grid is going to need, and to do it without a carbon footprint, seems to me it's a pretty terrific technology. I understand all the political sensitivities around nuclear and so on and so forth. So how that gets sorted out over the next decade or so, I don't know. But it's hard for me to envision. I mean, everybody that I've that's studied this problem always comes back and says you're going to need some core of dispatchable generation. Right? You can put a lot of variable generation around the system, but there needs to be something in the center of it that is dispatchable and controllable. And nuclear is a great option for that if we can figure out how to build it and build it safely and so forth. So I think it's a multidimensional question, and I don't really have great insight as to how it's going to resolve, but I certainly see the technical appeal to that from a grid perspective. Well, look, thank you very much. Mike, I appreciate the invitation to be here, and I hope that was somewhat entertaining and informative. And again, would love any other comments that you have, funnel them to me. And it's been, like I said, a pleasure to be here, so thank you very much.